So this morning I leveled my base as best as I could on these bricks and then put all my cases on there and connected them at the joints with these C-clamps just to pull them together. You can see I put them up top too. You can see where these clamps are on the cases, and then going up, those are the two joints. And the main thing that you're doing when you're clamping these together is making sure that these two are as flush as possible. If one of them is even slightly proud of the other, when you put your face frame on, it will have, differences. And you could sand it down where they meet, but it's just easier if you get it as flush as possible. So once I have everything flush and clamped together, at the bottoms, all the way at the bottom I did it, but underneath each shelf I countersunk a hole and then put two 2.25 inch screws through there to connect the shelves. And I did that in the front and the back all the way up the case. And now I could take those C-clamps off, and then on the back side I numbered each cabinet because I have to take this apart every night because it can't be out here. And then once it goes for install, you'll want it in the same spot. So now that they're screwed together, these screws will come out for transportation, but you'll still have the holes. Now that everything is connected, it's going to be time to add the splines in here. The cut is a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to cut the splines 1 inch because I'll cut a 1/2 inch onto the poplar as well. So I have this 1/8 inch chipboard that came in the packaging for a piece of furniture, and I kept it. So I'm going to take these and rip them down on my table saw, and that is what is going to be the material for my splines. With these strips ripped, I filled in the long verticals, and then for the horizontals, to cut them down the sides, I just take a guess measurement, and you could snip this stuff with aviator snips. And that will slide right in. So this is what it looks like with all those splines on. And the best part about these splines are, now that it's time to put the face frames on, where they're going to be connecting to the splines, everywhere you check, if you did it right, is a perfect 90-degree angle. So you're not going to have to mess around with the face frames. You could pretty much just cut that back and put them right on. If you were building this on site, these middle stiles you could cut as a 2-inch wide piece and attach by putting 2 grooves in the back and adding them right to there. But since I have to take these apart and I want to be able to fit my doors, I'm going to attach these in 2 different pieces. So with all the middles dry fitted, I ripped these 2.5 pieces that are going to go on the ends. And that will give me plenty of room, since this is smaller than the actual room, to scribe this to the wall. So with those stiles in place, I can start cutting my rails. And the spacing is going to be the same. It's going to have about 3/8 on the top, and then there's going to be an overhang on the bottom, because these are going to be about 1.5 inches. Now, because this is all dry fitted in place, it kind of wants to move around a little bit. So I just put some C-clamps on here to bring the joint together, so I have the right measurement for when I cut all of these. Cut the backs of my poplar, I lowered my blade to about a 1/2 inch, and I still have the test piece of plywood from when I cut the grooves in my cases. So I'm just going to take that notch and line it back up with my blade. and then set my fence so that I'll know that that poplar is going to be cut the exact same size as what's on the plywood. All those middle rails in place, I'm going to start framing out the cabinet and the tops. And the cabinets, I'm going to do 2.5 rails, and the tops I'm either going to do 2.5 or 3. So I'm going to rip more poplar down on my table saw and trim them and start fitting them just like the middle rails. So as I'm kind of putting all this together, I was thinking about making the cabinet doors, and I noticed that I'm cutting all the grooves in the back of these flush, which works out for the shelves, but on the two sides, unlike the middle, where you'll have a lip to attach your hinge, on the side, there is no lip, and they make hinges. They make hinges for frameless cabinets for inset doors, because these doors are going to be inset doors, but to just make my life easier, instead of attaching 2 different types of hinges, I'm just going to take the outer stiles off, flip them, and rip a new edge on the back that will put these in a little bit. And I'll have to trim all of the rails I've already installed, but that will be easier, I think, than mounting 2 different style of hinges in these cabinets. I ended up making the rails around the cabinet doors 2 inches, and the top ones are going to be 2.5, and those are the last thing I have to add. So I'm going to cut those and add those now, and then this can all be glued on. With all the pieces cut and I made sure they fit, now it's time to glue everything together. So to make it go quicker, I went and removed all the rails, and now I'm going to glue all the stiles in and then all the rails. So this piece of chipboard is going to get glued into the groove, and then this is going to get glued on top of it. To make sure everything stays in place, I have my finishing nailer set up with 2.5-inch screws, which is overkill, but that's all I have on me right now. And in order to help with getting glue on those splines, I set up this piece of tape in between 2 pieces of wood, and it made this valley. I could just go through and dip these, and they'll have full coverage, and I could stick them in the grooves. The only other thing to remember before you start gluing these together, which I actually momentarily forgot, is that the 2 outsides are going to have to be scribed to fit the walls, because the walls are most likely not perfectly plumb. So those will not be glued into their edges. I'm going to glue the splines into the poplar, but not glue the poplar to the case. With all those vertical stiles attached, I'm now going to unscrew my cabinets and separate them just a little bit, just in case there's any glue that got in between those 2 vertical stiles. Since these are being moved, obviously, I don't want them to stick together. So I'm going to separate them and move them apart before I do and attach the rails. My face frame's in place. I could finally start measuring and making the 8 doors that are going on the bottom. These are going to be really simple shaker style doors, and I just went through and measured each cubby, and the measurements are fairly consistent. These aren't perfectly square. I knew that before I put it together. It's really hard to get things square with the space I have to work with. But that won't really matter because they're inset doors, so I could, shave and trim them until they're perfect, and you won't even be able to tell if they're a 16th or 32nd of an inch off. I measured the cubbies, and there's about a consistent 23 inches vertically, and we're at about 28 3/4, give or take, for each opening. So I'm going to round the 28 up to 29, which will give me space to shave off each side. And I'm going to make 2 per opening. And I'll obviously open like this. So I'm going to use the leftover poplar I have to make my rails and my stiles, and I make a lot of these doors for other contractors, and I already have some pre-cut stiles and rails, and I'm just going to stick with the width of these for my door since I already have some cut. So my rails and stiles are both going to be an inch. It's like an inch and 7/8. So the rest of my wood I'm going to rip down to get those inch and 7/8 and start making the doors. Now I have a video already that shows how to make shaker style doors. So instead of going through that process again, I'm just going to put a link in the description to those videos if you want to make your own custom doors. I think that video also covers shaker style with a raised panel insert. These are just going to be flat panels. But the difference on this project versus the project I was making the doors for was that was a frameless piece of furniture, and this furniture will have face frames on it, so the hinges are a little bit different. So I'll probably end up detailing how you mount these on the cabinet versus using those other videos. But if you want to learn how to make the doors for this, I'll link to that other video. I installed these doors yesterday, and I used these hinges. I've never used these before, and I used them just because the ones I like, the European style cup hinges, were out of stock. So this has a pretty strict time frame, so I ended up using these. I would not recommend these. They're cheaper, but they take a lot more time to install. So I would just stick with the video I've already posted of how to install inset hinges on YouTube already. You can use those hinges I used even if you have a face frame by doing exactly what I did here, and that's just shimming it out so it's flush with the face frame. You could buy, I think, plastic ones of these, but it's just as simple to use wood. So now that the doors are attached, pretty much the last thing I have to do is make these adjustable shelves. And I'm just going to use a piece of pegboard and a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. I cut this to 10 inches, and then I'm just going to put this on top to get my row. I'm not doing a massive amount of holes because these shelves are not, these cabinets are not super large, and no one's going to mount a shelf up here. So I'm just doing 6, and to get this lined up on every one, I'm going to come in 1.25 inches from the back. All those shelf brackets installed, I can now measure and cut the 4 shelves for these cabinets. Now the 2 ends are a little bit wider because the face frames are different, so I have to measure each one, but the depth is going to be the same. And the cabinet opening is 14.5, and I'm going to cut these to about 13 inches so they don't come right up to the front. The space in between the brackets is about 29.25, but I'm just going to cut these out of 3/4 inch plywood that's left over from the cabinets. I'm not going to worry about finishing the edges on the side or the back because you won't see them, and on the front I'm just going to add a little strip, thin strip, probably an 1/8 inch strip of poplar that I'm going to rip off the leftover wood from the face frames. There are a couple other pieces of furniture that are being built with this built-in, and one of them is a filing cabinet. I'm going to post a video of that being made later down the line. But I have these cutoffs from the face frames from that. They're about 1/4 of an inch, and rather than ripping new poplar, I'm just going to use these to face the front of the shelves. These cabinets out of the nicer grade maple veneer plywood, so the surface of it is already fairly smooth. And since I sand in between, lightly sand in between my prime coats and my paint coats, I'm not really going to bother with sanding the bulk of the surface of these cabinets. It's kind of a waste of time. I'm mostly concentrating on, I have some glue in spots, I'm going to take that all off, and then sanding the doors. Now, usually I would patch. Normally I would patch all my nail holes before putting the primer on, but it's getting kind of late in the day, so I think I'm just going to sand this all lightly, spray it with primer, and then in between the primer and the top coat, depending on whether or not I do 1 or 2 coats, I'll patch all these holes, just so I could stay on schedule. I'm ready to paint this built-in, and I have painted these by hand before. It's really not terrible because, like I said earlier, you don't have to paint the sides or the back or the bottom or the top. You're just painting the front. But with all those shells, it's just really hard to get all the nooks and crannies with the brush. So someone gave me one of these paint sprayers a couple months ago. I've used it a couple times. And this one's only recommended for oil-based paint, which is why I bought oil-based primer, and that is what I'm going to put on there with the gun. I also bought this, this was a color picked out by the customer, and it's one of those 2-in-1 primer and paints, and these are very good products. What I have found on something that's bare wood being painted for the first time, it will just say you could probably get away with 1 coat of this if you already have a primer put down, which is why I'm doing this Kills oil-based primer. So this primer had a chance to dry overnight, and that's what it looks like. And basically what I'm going to do now is all these little nail holes, I'm going to fill them with filler. Let it dry, sand it light, the whole. This is my go-to for patching. I like it because it's cheap, it dries really quick, it's super easy to sand, and it doesn't have a ton of shrinkage. Like, I've used joint compound before, and you usually have to apply 2 or 3 coats in a little hole because it will shrink as it dries. I just finished lightly sanding the entire surface of that built-in with 120 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander, and now I'm going to top coat it. The primer went on pretty well with pretty good coverage, and since this is paint and primer, I'm hoping I could get away with 1 coat. Now, like I said earlier in the video, the sprayer I have is not designed for latex-based paints, it's designed for oil-based paints. And I misspoke yesterday, this is actually acrylic, it's not latex. And obviously I don't think it's something that's going to ruin the gun, I just don't think it's going to spray properly. And I looked into it last night, and from what I gathered online, the main issue is latex and acrylic based paints are heavier than oil based paints, so they don't spray out of the gun as nice, and they kind of leave little pockmark bubbles all over the surface if you don't thin it properly. So I really don't want to paint this. I mean, I would use a roller, which is a little bit faster than a brush, but I'd really want to spray it. So I'm going to mix up a small batch and test it out and see if I could get it to work with the gun. If not, I'm just going to use a roller and a paintbrush. And since this is acrylic, you could just thin it with water. You don't have to thin it with paint thinner. So that's the built-in drying, and I'm going to deliver it this afternoon. It won't be installed till tomorrow, but I'm going to deliver it this afternoon. The spray gun worked for exactly 1 case. It worked amazingly for exactly 1 case, and then it clogged and it wouldn't work anymore, so the rest of it was rolled.